So next up is the ground plane. So for this we'll use Quixel Mixer. We'll use a 4x4 meter plane, and we'll add a surface layer. We have a large library already, and we'll go to stones, stones on soil. So you can see it's very clear that it's tileable texture. So the key is to add as many layers as possible to make it not feel like it's a tileable texture. If we click on the top left, you can see that it shows you a larger tile. But always keep in mind what the camera angle is going to be. Sure, it looks tileable if you look at it from above, from God POV, but that's not what we're going to be looking at it from. We'll add a noise, and that alone just breaks up the surface nicely. We could play with the amplitude and the frequency. You could see that starts looking a little bit better. Bring the octaves up. That makes a really big difference. Bring up the persistence. And if we overcrank this, just for the hell of it, we could see what it's doing. So let's bring that back down. So let's go in and add another surface layer. We'll add a soil. So you can see, you could still see the underlying stones on soil peeping through. And we could play with the settings, either blend from above or blend from below. So you get a different effect. And we could also play with the threshold. So you can see it tiling. So we'll play with the threshold a bit to reveal a little bit more of the stone below. Okay, so it starts looking a little bit more organic. The soil clay is definitely too mustardy, so we'll fix that later. When you bring up the wrap to base, it doesn't completely override the underlying displacement. So it's good to play around with that a little bit. We could play with the high frequency slider, get a little bit more detail in there. Let's see it tiled. We're only going to see a small section of this. We'll never know it's tileable. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. We'll go into our reflectance, diffuse, desaturate it a bit, darken it as well. Press apply. So under repetitions, I'm going to double that up to 8. And you can see it's giving us a warning below that says scaled to 50% of the correct size. So basically it's telling us, hey, you're scaling this to an inappropriate size, but it's okay. I don't care what that says. If it looks good, it is good. I'm also going to set the HDRI to be more overcast, because ultimately we're not going to have a lot of reflection anyway. So I want to see what it looks like flatter. I'll also go in and I'll throw in an atlas layer to give me some more seashells. So you can see the seashells are there. They look very bright. So we'll go into our diffuse and darken those guys up. We could sample color. That looks better. And I'll go to export. Initially, I'm going to export it as 4096 by 4096. I have a feeling we're going to come back to this, and I'll export it at a higher resolution later. So we'll export this out. if you scroll down, you could see that everything is being saved in an 8-bit format except for our displacement, which is a 32-bit EXR. So it's exporting a total of 6 maps. Back in Maya, we have our plane. I already plopped in a light. We'll go in real quick and throw in all our different maps, so our diffuse, our spec, our gloss, etc. I won't bore you through this. You can see we're just trying to dial down the UV repetition. Okay, we got to make sure that they're all using the same 2D placement node. That way we adjust one of them and it propagates across all of the different textures that are connected to this ground shader. So let's just plug in our 2D placement nodes. Let's delete the unused 2D placement nodes. Keep everything nice and organized. Let's name our shader. And now let's go in and go to Create V-Ray, V-Ray Displacement. Apply single V-Ray displacement node to selection. We'll add a file texture. So let's load that up. Let's go to Attributes, V-Ray, allow negative colors. Alpha is luminance. Let's go to Attributes, V-Ray, displacement controls. And we'll bring up the displacement amount if we want to. Let's do a test first with 1. Before we do that though, let's make sure that it's using the same 2D placement node so the displacements and the color line up. Let's do a quick IPR. So that looks good, but I think the bump map looks a little crunchy, the normal map, so we'll set that to a very low number just to make sure we know what we're looking at. Are we seeing the displacement or too much normal map? We'll rotate around and take a look. Remember, we're gonna see it pretty close up, so it doesn't matter if it looks tileable. We'll set the bump map to 0. I just want to make sure I'm seeing the displacement first, and then I could dial that back up. Back in Quixel, I'll go in and I'll darken the sand a little bit. I wasn't a big fan of the previous one, so we'll just replace that. I've loaded up a brown ramp and a noise texture. It's just regular noise, regular ramp. You can see there's nothing special about it. And noise, I always use the Perlin noise. It's the one I'm used to using. We could just play with those settings, and I want to use these to blend and adjust the values of my color map. So I'll load 3 textures. I'll put the ramp in the bottommost layer. I'll put my diffuse map in the middle, and then in the top I'll put the noise layer. And I could set that to multiply. So if we check that now, oh, I forgot to plug it in, I think, yes. you're gonna see it looks extremely strong. It looks way too strong. Too much contrast on the blacks. So we'll go in there and lower that. That looks better. Maybe a little less. It's too little. That's looking better. Now I could go to that, my actual texture map from Quixel and lower the opacity a bit, just to have a little bit more brown peeping through it. And that looks much better. So I'll throw in just a throwaway Lambert texture. I'll go to my 3D painting tools. I'll assign a color map. 2K is fine. And I will flood this with black. And then just go in and paint a bunch of white splotches. This is where I want my grass to be. So I'm getting some weird playback issues because Camtasia is recording the screen, but you get the idea. We'll save those textures out. We'll go back to our original shader and then go to Create V-Ray, V-Ray Fur, add V-Ray Fur to selection. Here we could preview the fur, turn it on and off, and everything below it is actually in the render settings. Or would affect the render settings, I mean. We could play with the bend, the taper, the gravity. And I'm going to drag the map I just created into the density texture of the fur. So now you can see the grass is only there. In terms of the distribution, I'm going to bring up per face to 400. And I'll just create a brown shader. I don't want this to look like very vibrant grass. I just want it to look like some stuff in the bottom. It could be some weird fibery stuff. Who knows what it is. It's just to give it some complexity. So we'll go in and adjust the length variance, the gravity variance, the direction variance, just to get more complexity. And we'll bring up the reflection just a bit so it doesn't look so dead. I probably won't even notice it, but just in case. Okay, so let's populate the floor with some pebbles. So we'll select, first let's actually scale down these rocks a little bit. I want to make sure they're sitting right on the ground plane. They could be interpenetrating a little, that's okay. And we'll freeze, transform, reset transformation. Make sure everything is set to 0, 0, 0. We'll go to Mesh, create Mesh Network, Mesh. And there we go, we'll have 10 copies. Now, I'll select these other rocks and I'll drag them into the Mesh Repro node. And then I'll go into the ID, and you can see that it says ID count 5. So that means that it could randomize between these 5 pebbles so they don't all look the same. Okay, we'll set the distribution type to mesh, drag the polyplane, and you can see it's scattered. There's just not enough rocks. So we'll bring the number of points up to 300. You can see that looks much better. We'll turn off ignore ramps. Adjust the rotation. Let's bring up the scale a bit so the smallest ones are not so small. We'll bring this up a bit more. As you can see as I fumble through this, that's why you would want to have your mesh editor. It's just easier to access. So we brought the amount of rocks up substantially, and when we press render, we get that. So we'll just go in and throw in a texture. These are so small that we could just move through this pretty quickly. So as I bring down the amount, it's just to darken it a bit. We'll bring up the amount to 5,000. Let's go to 15,000. That looks better. Since we have so many, let's make the smallest scale a little bit smaller. That looks good. And I'm going to darken the ground a little bit more. Bring up the fur length. Let's darken it. So here's a quick render. You can see the barnacles are looking good. So using the same method, I just brought in another rock to put closer in the foreground, just to give it a little bit more depth. And those two have the barnacles growing everywhere. The barnacles, you could add as many as you possibly want. You could triple the amount. It would still look great. So let's go in and add an environment fog. We'll go to V-Ray environment fog, plug that in, and if you ever plug in the fog and it looks black, it's not that there's too little fog, it's usually the opposite. It's there's too much fog. So the first thing I always adjust is my fog density, and I'll go in there and just bring that down. You could see immediately you see more fog. So this always used to throw me off because I used to think the fog was broken because it was black, and it was actually so much fog that it was blocking out all the light. So we'll just bring this down. And we'll bring up the fog distance a little to push it further back. And the fog height, the default is 100, but I think this scene is a little bit bigger. So you can see it ties everything up and makes it all feel more uniform. It is very dark, but the shot is a very dark shot. I'm bringing in some seaweed that I got from Speed Tree.